So of course your work, as I said, it just resonates in so many different ways. So it's been really helpful and inspirational for me. So thank you for that.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm
So
glad.
good. Thank you. Okay. So I'll just jump in. Um, the where I want to start is just sort of on that broad level. Your perspective on this idea of a micro grief and a macro grief, and how you think these experiences of grief might be similar or different.
Okay. Well, on one level, grief is grief. It's loss. And, one of the irrefutable factors of being human is loss. To be human is to experience loss. And how we respond to that determines a lot of things. It determines how we live the rest of our lives. It determines what our meaning and purpose is, what our values are. And it also determines how well we're going to be able to function in the face of those losses, and how we're going to respond to other people in the face of those losses. So grief is an enormous teacher. And that is what our culture doesn't seem to understand. We're one of the few cultures in the world that really doesn't deal with loss, in a very effective way. Or we resent it, we resist it. We think that there's something wrong with us when we experience loss. And we don't value it for what it is, that it's part of the human condition. And we are alone in that compared to most cultures. Most cultures see loss very differently. They do see it as part of the human condition. And they know how to grieve.
Yes, right. In what ways do you think that making greater space for grief, whether that's personally in our own little bubbles or broadly culturally, how is that beneficial?
Okay. Well, let me answer that by going back to two of my teachers from the Dagara tribe of West Africa. That's spelled Dagara. Malidoma and Sobanfu Somé, which you sound familiar with. And in their culture, the Dagara tribe, grief is considered sacred and holy and really, really valued for its healing power and its cleansing power. And the assumption in that culture is that grief is something we need to discharge. We need to authentically feel it and then discharge it. And if we don't discharge it, it becomes toxic to the community. So the Dagara tribe has a grief ritual very frequently, and a community grief ritual, and it's maybe even once a week. Because they really see the importance of cleansing the community of the toxicity that ungrieved grief holds. If we, in our culture, were able to do that, I believe it would be a very, very different culture.
And just a warning, I cry a lot.
Yeah. Well, that is exactly.
And it's already.
That is exactly what a woman in the Dagara tribe told my friend Francis Weller. I'm sure you're familiar with his work. The Wild Edge of Sorrow is his famous book on grief. And when he visited Burkina Faso and the Dagara tribe with Malidoma, it was after a grief ritual that he was walking around the village, and he ran into this woman who was just beaming. She was just really happy. And they started talking. He said, "Did you go to the grief ritual?" And she said, "Oh, of course, of course." He said, "Well, you look so happy." And she said, "I'm happy because I cry all the time."
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Um, uh, on the one hand, I cry a lot. On the other hand, I need to cry more. So I love that story.
Yeah, yeah, right, right.
Thank you. What do you wish people knew about grief?
Oh, I wish people knew, first of all, how human it is, that it is as natural as eating or sleeping or drinking water or going to the bathroom. It's part of who we are as humans.
Mhm,
We need to grieve,
mhm,
and we become ill on different levels when we don't.
mhm. This is, I think something that's sort of been in the back of my mind, but it just sort of popped in as a question. And I feel like there's no answer and there's not a good answer, but I just want to throw it out. I think so many of us live in terror of grief.
Yeah,
I mean, I have for most of my life until I didn't have a
yeah,
choice.
yeah,
And there it was.
yeah.
Uh,
I, I have noticed that people are extremely terrified of grieving.
yeah,
For
yeah,
the most part, people are really afraid to feel the grief. And then
yeah,
when they do, when they allow themselves to feel it, they discover a lot of things. They discover that it didn't kill them.
yeah.
They feel relief. And it's been my experience in the many grief workshops that I've done and rituals, that people say, "Wow, I'm seeing colors today that I wasn't seeing yesterday. It seems
Mm,
like everything is clearer."
mhm,
And invariably, when I've done grief rituals, people end up celebrating and singing and experiencing joy.
mhm, mhm,
And
mhm,
so it's usually a great surprise to most folks.
mhm,
The first time they really allow themselves to grieve, it's usually a great surprise to experience very positive effects.
mhm, mhm.
It didn't kill me, it didn't destroy me. I didn't lose my mind and become psychotic. In
Yeah,
fact, I am feeling more and I'm feeling more alive. I think that's the big one. I'm
yeah.
feeling more alive. Oh, and by the way, I'm feeling some joy.
Mhm,
If you look at the word happy, the first three letters, HAP, is related to also the word happenstance. So it
mhm,
comes and goes. When things are peachy, I'm happy. When
mhm,
things are not peachy, I'm unhappy. Joy
mhm,
is something different. Joy
mhm,
is something that lives in our core. It's at the
mhm,
core of our humanity.
mhm,
And we can access it even when we're sad.
mhm, mhm,
Viktor Frankl talks about experiencing joy in the midst of a concentration camp
mhm,
because
mhm,
he really experienced meaning and purpose. And
mhm,
none of what was going on around him was made him happy. But
mhm,
accessing that core of meaning and purpose was joyful for him.
mhm, mhm,
And
mhm,
so it is for all of us.
mhm. Idea of the relationship between grief and joy, grief and aliveness. Certainly that was something I would have never understood or guessed as being part of grief, but I understand it so much more now. I imagine them as friends holding hands, grief and joy.
Mhm,
Um, and so I'm just wondering if you can say more about that, because I think that that's something that people, as you said, they don't know.
mhm. Well, energetically, they're polar opposites, and polar opposites are always connected.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Mary Oliver's wonderful segment of one of her poems, we shake with grief, we shake with joy. What a time these two have, housed as they are in the same body. So when you really touch one, you touch another. And I think, you know, it's like for example, on a beautiful day, you know, here in Colorado, for example, we go out, maybe we sit beside a stream in the mountains, and we look at the sky and the clouds and the sunshine, and um, there's a there's a bit of melancholy in it. There's a bit of sadness in it. And we don't always know what that is, you know. Well, it might be that part of us is grieving because maybe there'll be a time when we can't see this because of climate change, um, or because we die. And so that loss, that potential loss, lives within us all the time, everywhere, no matter what we're doing. It's there on some level, whether it's unconscious or conscious. You know, I think, you know, there's a wonderful song, John Denver's Sunshine on the Water Makes Me Happy. Sunshine on the water makes me cry.
Right. Like that's right. Our culture wants to deny grief, but I think it also wants to deny the knowledge of that joy too.
Yes, yes. Because our culture is focused on happiness, it's not focused on joy. And happiness is circumstantial, it comes and goes.
This is so tied to the consumerism,
Oh, absolutely.
right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Buy this, you're going to be happy. Watch this movie, you're going to be happy.
yeah.
Get a new boyfriend, you're going to be happy.
Right, right, right. I'm thinking a lot about, again, the back and forth. If joy and grief are holding hands, the way that life and death hold hands.
Yes. Yes.
And this sense of walking with death. In fact, what I was thinking of is living into death through all of this grief. And so it's one of the reasons I was just so happy to find your writing, because you talk about that exact phrase, living into collapse and
Whatever.
the
Yeah.
chaos and such.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering if you can say a little bit more about that idea of walking hand in hand, living into, living with
Mhm.
all of the sadness and the collapse and the grief and death around us.
Yeah. Well, that is certainly not easy.
Mhm.
I think it's the biggest challenge any of us has right now. Um, Living into means I'm conscious that it's happening. I'm not pulling the covers over my head. I'm not in denial about it. I'm not trying to anesthetize it with consumerism and trying to stay happy all the time. And I allow myself to grieve as well as celebrate. I shake with grief, I shake with joy. And life is just this enormous mix of both.
Mhm.
And I'm awake to that. I own that. And it's not an easy road because it's much easier to be asleep. That's how we live into it. And I don't believe for 1 minute that we do it perfectly. Some days are easier than others. Some days it's just not possible to live into sorrow. It's just like we're pummeled by it. And then we allow it, we own it, we accept it. That's what is. And then we come back to a place of joy. and
Mhm.
know that the grief will come again.
Yeah, that's something that well, I turned to in grief, and it was sort of an important personal realization that I'm exploring in the book, is the idea of basically mindfulness, and how grief for me really directed me to the present moment, even when the present moment was so awful,
Mhm,
because remembering the past was almost worse.
mhm,
Remembering when they were alive,
mhm.
I couldn't go back to those memories, and imagining the expanse of the future with that void was too much.
Right.
And so even when I was in the midst of grief, being present was the only
Oh,
place that
absolutely.
I could live,
Absolutely.
which then of course opens you up to all the magic of mindfulness. Right.
Right.
Particularly in terms of climate collapse, is I don't know how to say it. I want to say, is that still acceptable? Is that bypassing? Is that denying and avoiding?
Is what denying and avoiding?
That present focus. I
Mm,
don't think it is.
no, no, I don't think it is at all. I
Okay.
mean, you're holding what's in the future. You know that's out there.
Yeah.
And maybe that's in 10 days, maybe that's in 10 years, maybe that's in 100 years. You
Yeah.
know that that collapse is inevitable. And you know that you're in the process of it right now. But for this moment,
Yeah.
I'm going to be present to what is.
Yeah.
And if that is a friend who baked me a bunch of cookies and wants to make me feel better, I'm gonna take that. I'm gonna accept that.
Yeah. Yeah.
If it's going outside and it's a beautiful day,
Mm.
and my heart is broken, but I'm going to accept the beauty that is here.
Mhm,
You
mhm,
know,
mhm, mhm,
that's
mhm,
going to change what's going to happen in the future. But
mm,
do I want to focus constantly on what's going to happen in the future?
mhm, 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 mhm. Right, because it also seems honoring of what is slipping away. Right, because if a loved one is dying in front of you, or not dying in front of you, but they're terminal, you want to take advantage of the time with them. I think likewise with the world, honor what is still here while it is still here.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right, right.
Yeah. There's a line in the movie Dances with Wolves, and at the very beginning of the movie, they asked John Dunbar, who's the main character, he's in the army, he's in the cavalry, and his
Mhm.
commanding officer says, "Why do you want to go west? Why do you want to go west?" He said, "I want to see it before it's gone."
Right. You certainly talk about this in your writing, but I would love to hear some more about it. How do you personally find meaning, or some sense of active hope in the midst of grief, whether that's on a micro level or a macro level?
Yeah. I find a tremendous amount of meaning, and these days I'm not looking for hope because
Mm.
hope is a very deceptive word. Some people call it a four-letter word.
Mhm, mhm,
Um, and you're right, it has to be active, as Joanna Macy says.
mhm, mhm,
Um, but I find a great deal of meaning and fulfillment in my work,
mhm,
in my writing.
mhm,
Um, in my friendships, in my relationship with my dog.
Mm-hmm.
And very recently here in Boulder, in the last couple of months, a bunch of us have come together. This is like 20 people I didn't even know before 2 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
And we've created a group of really preparation and awareness. Um, we don't have a name for our group yet because we're only a couple of months old.
Mm-hmm.
But, it started out with an invitation from two of these folks to an end of the world brunch.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
then it just became the end of the world club.
Okay.
We're going to change the name at some point. We don't know when it's going to be yet.
Okay.
But, these people, when I came to Boulder, I started a group on collapse. That was 15
Mm-hmm.
years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to be very low key. I could not talk about it
Mm-hmm.
because,
Mm-hmm.
people thought I was nuts.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so for 15 years, that group lasted 6 years. But for the last 15 years, until I met these folks recently, I wasn't really talking locally about collapse. All of my work was somewhere else.
Right. Right. Right.
And, now I feel like I've come out of the closet and here are all these wonderful people who are on the same page.
Right.
And, we don't agree on everything, but uh,
Mm-hmm.
w- we are focused on our predicament as human beings on this planet.
Mm-hmm.
And we're working together emotionally and spiritually to
Mm-hmm.
prepare ourselves and logistically to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
But we're kind of holding each other's hands and going on this journey together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's just very, very affirming. And I'm finding tremendous meaning and joy in that.
Right. 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 Right.
And, which reminds me that none of us should open ourselves to grief without support.
Right.
I do not tell people or encourage people to, go on this grief journey by themselves. If you're going to get serious about grieving and really open to it, you need support.
Mm-hmm.
You need
Mm-hmm.
support from people who get it.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's not even in your local community. Maybe that's somewhere else.
Yeah.
But reach out to those folks. There's a wonderful good grief network
Mm-hmm.
that, Laura and Amy are the two women who founded that group, and they do some wonderful things and give it a lot of support for people who are grieving. Reach out,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but don't try to do it on your own.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yes. I feel that very, very personally.
Yeah,
Because most people don't know what to do with it,
right.
whether it is
Yeah,
micro or macro.
yeah,
They don't know what to do with it. And I've had some relationships significantly suffer because of that.
sure,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, you're probably familiar with Stephen Jenkinson's work.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what he says is, being woke is not cool.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He says being woke or waking up is a grief soaked proposition.
Right. 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 Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, my eyes are open, but they're also filled with tears.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it's the tears that soften us, right? If we allow it
Yes.
to create so much more compassion.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's where compassion really begins, is with ourselves and our
Mm-hmm.
own grief.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, this would have been, well, what are the years now? I don't know. I think it was the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attack. And I was watching the memorial in New York. Um, and they have family members and friends recite the names, and
Right.
some of them get to talk about their person publicly on the stage. And it was just stunning to me, the level of grief after 20 years, that the person is still crying, that it's still hard to, I mean, and let alone in such a horrifically violent and sudden way. But it just made me think about the degree to which most of us are walking around with that tenderness, with that grief and sadness, but there's no outlet for it.
Right. Right.
Right? There's no recognition of that. There's no cultural conversation around that.
Right. So if you're familiar with Malidoma and Sobafu's work, you probably know that the elders of the Dagara tribe sent them to the United States to teach us how to grieve.
Mm-hmm.
And the way they did that mostly was with grief rituals.
Mm-hmm.
And Francis Weller was a big mover and shaker in that. He was one of their top students. And, you know, through them and through his work, Francis' work, I learned how to do grief rituals. And every time I do one, it's been a few years since been able to do one, but I'm planning to do one with this new group that I just told you about in the fall. But every time I do one, I realize that I'm just baffled, you know, just gobsmacked with realizing what this could do for our culture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If we were able to have these grief rituals collectively.
Mm-hmm.
And one person's whose work is not that per se, but focused on bringing healing to wounded places. You may be familiar with Trevi Johnson's work. So she does a lot of rituals of taking people to wounded places. I don't know if she's been to Sandy Hook yet, but that would be an example.
Okay.
Or you know, Ground Zero in New York.
Literal places.
Yes, taking people
Oh,
to places and doing ritual for those wounded places,
wow. Okay.
which really helps the place and it
Yeah.
helps people who are doing the ritual.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
And
Yeah.
so, you know, my goodness, if we could have, you know, that kind of conscious grieving. I don't mean just everybody sitting around singing Kumbaya and lighting candles,
Yeah. Yeah.
but really having a structure for allowing ourselves to grieve with support, with permission,
Mm-hmm.
and experience what that's really like.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And notice how it tends to bring us into gratitude and joy.
Mm-hmm. Well, very related to that, and this is entirely you, and sort of inspiring my thinking. But the idea of awe and wonder, right? I think related to this idea of joy, gratitude,
Yes,
aliveness.
yes.
But as I read your writing on that, I could feel it in my body. Awe and wonder and grief. I need to do more thinking about that, but I'm just wondering if there's something you can say about that, the relationship, because it seems very related to the joy and the aliveness, but it's also something different. It seems like there's a little bit of a different angle in terms of awe and wonder and grief. And as you quote, I can't remember who now, but the idea, a woman who wrote about awe in scientific exploration. And the idea that awe and wonder can help us to fill in the gaps around the things we don't know.
Mhm.
And I feel like that's a bridge to thinking about, for me, and I definitely want to hear your thoughts on this, but the idea of life after death, that's something that's just always been there for me, but particularly when my people died, and especially when my father died,
Mhm.
I really needed to cling to that. And
Mhm.
he communicated with me so much in astonishing ways.
Mhm.
I think I'm sort of babbling, but that brings me to the awe and the wonder and the idea that we can't know entirely what's on the other side or what that's like or how we continue to exist if you believe that we continue to exist. But the awe and the wonder of the possibility and the glimpses of it can fill in some of those gaps and allow us to, again, survive through that grief. Does any of that make any sense to you? Or is there something else you want to say about awe and wonder?
Well,
Again, I'm just sort of
I
thinking it
think you pretty much said it. I mean,
through. Okay.
I'm totally with you on that.
Okay.
Yeah, because awe and wonder, among other things, opens the heart. And when the heart starts to open, then other things start to open. And it will invariably touch our grief. There's tremendous joy in it.
Mhm.
You know, you go outside at night and up in the mountains and you look at the stars and you're just aghast,
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and there's tremendous joy and openness. And then that's going to start to ripple and touch. This is all energy.
Mhm.
Consciousness is energy,
Mhm. Mhm.
energy flow within us and outside us.
Mhm.
And so these ripples of energy, touch the heart, bring up joy, bring up sadness, gratitude,
Mhm.
all kinds of emotions.
Mhm. Mhm. So can I ask about your thinking or feeling or belief about whatever happens when our bodies die?
Yeah, you asked the question in your notes about, do you believe in life after death? Well, what is life? What is death?
Mm-hmm.
Life continues,
Mm-hmm.
some other form.
Mm-hmm.
And that is awesome to think about that.
Mm-hmm.
That for me, it brings tremendous wonder and amazement.
Mm-hmm.
Mary Oliver's work, she just talks about amazement and the gift of being amazed.
Mm-hmm. 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 Mm-hmm.
I think she said something in one of her poems about being the bride of amazement.
Mm-hmm. 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 Does
So,
your, I'm sorry, go ahead.
so, it's a continuum from my perspective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, yes, there is physical death. There is no spiritual death. There is no, the death of who we truly are in our core,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the deeper self.
So how does that do anything for you, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, regarding climate collapse? Does that provide you any, of course it can provide comfort when a loved one dies, but how does that broader view of the continuation of life for you relate to the earth itself?
Well, climate collapse is bigger than I am.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Um, and, I don't know what's going to happen when I leave the planet. Um, I don't know if I'll go somewhere else permanently or if I'll come back here. I don't know.
Mm,
I don't I don't find any comfort necessarily in my beliefs about life and death. Um, Life goes on
mhm,
for
mhm,
everyone,
mhm, mhm.
but it's tragic,
Mhm, mhm,
absolutely horrific what we are doing to ourselves and the planet.
mhm, mhm,
Both are true.
mhm, mhm. Thank you. Um, can- is there anything that you'd like to say about um the connections between our denial of grief, our denial of death, um, and I guess I want to say patriarchy in particular, although it's so many things, right? It's racism and white supremacy and consumerism and capitalism, which is allowing us to destroy the planet. But is there something that you might want to say about this? What I mentioned as sort of the feminine texture of death, the dark goddess, um, because I think that there's a lot behind that in terms of patriarchy and those kinds of hierarchies and our denial of our bodies, our spirits, the earth itself, right? Our grief. I sort of put those into a very, very related buckets.
Right. Well, indigenous people, originally, not necessarily modern indigenous people, but traditional indigenous people didn't have that problem. I mean, they, it was like, it was egalitarian and so often matriarchal.
Mhm,
And they were able to hold all of these opposites and experience them as part of life. And it was when civilization, however you want to define that,
mhm,
um, began to destroy indigenous peoples,
mhm,
that
mhm,
that wisdom and that ability to hold the opposites began to deteriorate. And then it became all about power and control and being separate from nature, in control of it, as opposed to married to nature,
mhm, mhm,
being a family with nature, being
mhm,
part of the natural family, is what I'm trying to say.
mhm, mhm,
And something in us longs for um, that quality of life that was lost.
mhm,
We can't go back and be indigenous people again, but we were at one time.
mhm,
And certainly we can appreciate those values and live those values in different ways in our lives today,
mhm, mhm, mhm,
starting
mhm,
with how we view the climate crisis. And
mhm,
the climate
mhm,
crisis is something that was created by us in an effort to have power and control rather than harmony with nature.
mhm,
And that's worth grieving.
mhm, mhm. And I suspect that if we didn't have the hierarchies that we have, patriarchy, white supremacy, um, I suspect we would be more open to grief and dying,
Oh yeah.
right?
Yeah. I really believe that.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you help me think that through? Because not that I think if women ruled the world, everything would be fine.
Right.
That's but if this sort of energy and way of thinking that we could call a feminine, more connected way of thinking. I think if we valued that,
Mhm.
then we would be more okay with the cycles of life.
Oh yes.
Not just valuing nature, but
Mhm.
okay with the cycles of life, which would mean death, which
Yes.
mean we would make more space for grief itself.
Yes. Yes. I agree with that.
Okay, okay, okay.
Absolutely. It has the main value that we're talking about here is connection,
Mhm,
relationship, relatedness. And capitalism is invariably about power over rather than
mhm,
power with.
mhm, mhm,
There are some good things about capitalism, but
mhm,
the model is certainly based on power and control.
mhm, mhm,
And a zero-sum game.
mhm, mhm. Okay. Um, you talk about the necessity of letting go in conscious grief.
Mhm.
Um, and of course, there's the idea of letting go of the thing that is lost, the person that is lost, right? Just in a very literal sense.
Yeah.
But I think there's something more behind that. I think you mean something more than that.
Well, I think I'm talking about surrender.
Mhm.
Um, expansion, contraction, expansion, contraction. That's just a part of our physical existence.
Mhm.
And when we do not allow ourselves to grieve, we're contracting.
Mhm. Mhm.
When we
Mhm.
surrender, we're opening. And then things can flow because when we contract, things cannot flow.
Mhm.
The energy is stifled.
Is there anything else that you want to add or anything that you're like, Carrie, obviously you should have asked me this question.
I'm not thinking that at all.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Um, it is very easy for activists, especially in the face of climate catastrophe, to just focus on the activism and
Mhm.
allow the fires of activism to motivate us.
Mhm. Mhm.
But we also have to temper those fires with the waters of grief.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
And so I see a lot of raging about what's going on the planet, which we should do, but very little water. And what
Mhm.
happens is to most folks who are very passionate activists is eventually they burn out because the fires of activism are not tempered with the waters of grief.
Mhm. Mhm.
So
Mhm.
if we can do our grieving with support and have our grief rituals, um, it's going to balance us,
Mhm.
really appreciating what we're fighting for,
Mhm.
really valuing that.
Mhm. Mhm. Right. Thank you. so, so much.
Well,
Um,
thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. And I wish you every success with your book. Let me know how it's going.
I will.